Well, good evening, and welcome to another edition of Understanding Our Times. A little bit of a crooked furrow still. I imagine it will continue to be for a while. I want to thank everyone for joining tonight, and everyone who has stayed with any of the other videos. If you're a newcomer, we're going to enter into Talking to Worldviews tonight. It's a bit cooler today. We're in this second week of August, which is quite nice. It's still hot, but we're getting that sense of something new, of a change. And of course, that's what we're talking about here, is a change in our society and our culture and trying to understand it. So I'm going to go back to James Sire's book, The Universe Next Door. It's very important to get a good understanding of worldviews before we go forward, and we can kind of anchor the rest of our discussions in these ideas. So this is the book right here. Oh well, can't do it, can't get it up. Let's see if I can do it. There we go. James Sire, The Universe Next Door. There's some YouTubes about him as well, interviews with him if you wish to pursue it further. But we started with the definition. There are actually 7 worldview questions he uses. And then, excuse me, I'm trying to get my glasses. So there are about 7 worldview questions that will help you identify your worldview. And after we consider the worldview questions, we can begin to look at specific worldviews. Now, I guess we should go over the definition of a worldview again. Excuse me. While I find that, I was looking for a quote I had by Houston Smith. I'll find that for next time. And those of you who are interested in comparative religion, he wrote the definitive book on world religions, which is used as a textbook in many colleges, The Religions of Man, Houston Smith. He also wrote a book, The Postmodern Mind, in which he has a very good description of this change that's taking place and a good definition of worldviews. So using Sire's definition, he says a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story, or it can be held as a set of presuppositions, assumptions, that can be true or false, or partially true or false, which we hold consciously or subconsciously, consistently or inconsistently, about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. So it's just what you assume to be true. And the purpose of these videos is to get people to examine their worldview very closely and to make it conscious and consistent. So the worldview questions then, we started with number 1. What is prime reality? What is really real? And we went over the various answers. You might answer God or gods or the material cosmos. If you think it's God or gods, then of course you define those more clearly. And this answer is fundamental because it sets the tones for the next 6 questions. Now, I actually think the most important question of the 7, I'm going to jump ahead, is number 5. And that is, why is it possible to know anything at all? Or you might say, how is it that we know? What do we depend on to know? Do we use our mind? Do we use our senses? The history of philosophy goes back and forth on that one. Of course, there are times where common sense says that we use them both. The Bible says that we use them both. If you remember the reading from Romans, where it says that all men, through their senses, through seeing what's here, and then reasoning about it in cause and effect, you can reason back to where did it come from? There had to be a cause, and what is that cause? That's what reason is. It works through causation. So naturally, the senses and reason work together, although in the history of philosophy, there has been a tendency to favor one side of the other. and to absolutize one side, either reason or the truth of the senses, which is called in philosophy empiricism. And we'll look at the various philosophers and how they deal with that. But the Bible from the very beginning speaks of how reason and the senses are combined, and then it further gives us the third way we know the truth, which is through revelation from some outside source. And if you choose that option, like I do, I believe the Bible is God's revealed truth, then you have to define that source. Sorkin mentions intuition, which is we might say a fourth way of discerning truth, because just that feeling, that was a big one for the Romantic movement, by the way, in its reaction to the Enlightenment, which had sort of settled in on pure reason and the absolutizing of reason. So the Romantic movement swings to the other side and says, no, it's kind of this intuitive, creative imagination that you see in the Romantic poets. So we have four ways of knowing truth. Do we know it through our reason, through our senses, through some sort of intuition, or a source external to us that reveals it? That's very important, because if you look at how you have to know how you determine truth before you come to any answer about what is real. So I would have put that one first. Why or how is it possible to know anything at all? The others that it mentions is what is the nature of external reality, the world around us? What is a human being? That's a good one too. From a very scientific worldview, you get a different answer to that question. Man is a machine, a bunch of atoms. We're reducible to our atoms moving around in space. Okay, as opposed to, and by chance, by the way, we're here by chance, or are we a special creation of God, made in His image, would be the Christian answer. What happens after death? Do we just decompose, a materialist worldview, naturalist worldview, or are we reincarnated? Those of you Eastern thinkers, are we reincarnated? Or do we die? Do we go to heaven or to hell? And and I think number 6 is an important one too. How do we know anything no, I've already said that one, sorry. How do we know right and wrong? Everybody believes in right or wrong. Everybody has a conscience. Again, going back to the Romans, chapter 1, it says that man is without excuse for not knowing and worshiping, acknowledging and worshiping God as such, because we know Him through our senses, our mind. Through reason, we can reason backwards to know that something created everything we see. And we also, so we know from the external world, there's a God, and we know from the internal conscious we have of right and wrong. That's in everybody is born with that. That isn't, where does that come from? And then how do we determine right or wrong? Again, there are many, many different theories, different ways that people determine ethics. Some people just, it's how I feel. Back to the intuition. Some, the greatest good for the greatest number, etc. And then there's Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative. We can get to that later, but the idea is there are different ways of determining right or wrong, but we all have some inborn sense of what is right and wrong. And we need to know how we determine it, and that will point us to our worldview. Number 7, what is the meaning of human history? To this we might answer, to realize the purposes of God, or the gods, and who are those gods, or that God, to make paradise on earth. That's kind of the humanist view, really, Marxist view, that you can have heaven here and now, to prepare people for life in community with a loving and holy God, and so forth. With these, but the thing is that these worldviews, you can't get away from them. These questions, you can't get away with them. Within these various basic worldviews, other issues are going to arise. For example, who is in charge of the world? God or humans or no one at all? Are we as human beings determined, or are we free? Are we alone the maker of values? Is God really good? Is God personal or impersonal? or does he exist at all? So, these questions are going to come up. You cannot avoid them. That's a really important idea. You cannot avoid assuming some answers to these questions. Refusing to adopt an explicit worldview will turn out to be itself a worldview, or at least a philosophical position. So we're caught. So long as we live either the examined or the unexamined life. Of course, that's from Socrates, who said the unexamined life is not worth living. It is that, so that's what we're about here. We're about examining our assumptions and trying to see if they are consistent and fit into a consistent worldview. Mr. Sire here mentions 7. I'm not going to, we might go over the 7. I'm going to be talking primarily about 3 of which, and he mentions them. The first one would be theism and Christian theism. And we can see how Christian theism answers these questions. And then he goes on to the scientific revolution and the clockwork universe. So those are the first 2 I'm going to be talking about. The cross. I'm working on a book called The Cross, the Clock, and the Circle. And we know what the cross is, Christian theism. The clock is the scientific worldview, the clockwork universe. We're going to talk about that. And then finally, the circle. I'm kind of putting the circle in the rest of the 4 he has. He talks about naturalism and kind of the New Age thing, but the journey to the East. And by the way, if you want to understand the worldview that we are in, and this I will be coming back to again and again, we are in an Eastern worldview. We are in a worldview dominated by an Eastern religions and Eastern philosophies. What was specifically the Western worldview, that worldview of the Enlightenment and of Christian theism has been rejected. The 3 worldviews I'll be talking about, the clock, the cross, the circle. The cross we know, but we're going to go into it. The clock is the scientific worldview, and the circle includes a lot of these other views, a lot of these other pantheistic views, and it certainly is an Eastern worldview. And we're going to go back to ancient Greece to find the origin of really the clock and the circle and the figures and the deities, so-called, of ancient Greece, of Apollo and Dionysus, respectively. And then we're going to see the Christian worldview based upon and centered in the reality of Jesus Christ. So those are the 3 worldviews. And we will see in the Enlightenment, again, the Enlightenment is essentially from Apollo. And the response to the Enlightenment in the Romantic movement is very Dionysian. It's very nature worship. You can trace it back to the East, to the Orient, and to primitive religions which overlap with it. But they're based on the same assumptions, and we'll see these picked up actually in the history of philosophy and how they lead us to the 1960s, to Friedrich Nietzsche. And we're going to come back to Nietzsche as well. But it's really important to understand that the West has lost its foundational principles. We have jettisoned the understanding that came from the Enlightenment and that from Christian theism. And we are now living out that worldview that came from the Romantic worldview, based in Eastern thought, and brought forward through German idealistic philosophy that burst onto the scenes in the 1960s with Friedrich Nietzsche and the counterculture, which is where I think we'll pick up next time. Thank you so much for your attention. Have a nice evening, and God bless.